Panetta 2015 lecture series, The Test of Leadership in 2015, Critical Issues That Can Unite or Divide America. This lecture discusses the economy. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mrs. Sylvia Panetta.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome once again to the Monterey Conference Center in beautiful Monterey by the Bay for the third event in the 18th annual Leon Panetta Lecture Series. It's been 18 years, folks. Our theme this year, as you know, is critical issues that can unite or divide America. It's been discussed through the topics of energy for the first event, race relations for the second event, and now I know from many phone calls and emails and letters that we've received and the conversations that I've had with audience members like you and those who are watching on television and on the internet, how much these lectures have prompted discussion, have prompted a desire to learn more, and have prompted greater understanding of these critical issues. Tonight, we turn our focus to the economy to see what new ideas and insights arise from our consideration of this vital issue. Recent statistics show that the American middle class is shrinking. What does this mean for our economy and for our democracy? Is this disparity the result of globalization and technological changes? Was the Great Recession the cause of lost jobs and stagnant wages? What role has the growing national debt played in our economy? Does expanding trade help or hurt our economy and jobs? As we consider the state of Wall Street and Main Street, are we protected from future economic threats? Have we taken the steps we need to ensure transparency and stability in our financial institutions? Is there a way to approach the economy that protects equal economic opportunity for all while still preserving the spirit of free enterprise that has made our nation an economic leader for so long? Are there solutions to be found in improving education and job training? What about tax reform and restructuring entitlements? Tonight, Leon will pose these questions and many more to some of the most respected economic experts of our time. Our first guest is internationally recognized for his research on economic growth, tax and budget theory and policy, saving and consumption patterns, and the implications of changing technology and demography on capital, labor, and product markets. He served as chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors during the administration of George H.W. Bush. He then went on to chair the Congressional Advisory Commission on the Consumer Price Index, where the report his commission produced was credited with transforming the way government agencies across the globe measure inflation, GDP, and productivity. Please welcome Michael Boskin. Welcome. Our second guest is a returning favorite of the lecture series. He is the former U.S. Secretary of Labor and served on President Barack Obama's economic transition team. He is the author of 15 books, and to name some, Supercapitalism, which warned of the perils of an under-regulated and over-leveraged financial system. Aftershock, The Next Economy and America's Future. And Beyond Outrage, which talks about what has gone wrong with our economy and our democracy and how to fix it. His forthcoming book, Saving Capitalism, examines the building blocks of the American economy and explores methods of preserving growth while spreading benefits. Please welcome Robert Reich. Welcome. Yes, we have. Our third guest is best known for her work on the causes of the Great Depression, the subsequent recovery, and the conduct and consequences of monetary and fiscal policy. She has also researched the impact of economic growth and inflation and the effects of tax cuts on private investment and government spending. As chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors in the administration of Barack Obama, she helped guide the administration's response to the economic crisis and played a key role in macroeconomic policy, rescue and reform of the financial system, healthcare reform, and budget policy. Please welcome Christina Romer. Welcome. And nice to have you. Our final guest is one of our most popular returning speakers and a wise and witty U.S. Senator from Wyoming. He served in the Senate for 3 terms and was Assistant Majority Leader for a decade. Leon and he served together on the Iraq Study Group, and in 2010, President Obama selected him to co-chair the bipartisan National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, better known as the Simpson-Bowles Commission. Since the release of the Commission's final report in 2010, he has been an outspoken critic of the failure of the 2 political parties to work together and agree on measures to reduce the deficit and govern the nation. Please welcome Alan Simpson. Welcome.
Creeping up. I want better this time. There we go, Ron. Better hitch up my pants here.
Moderating the discussion is the man who created this lecture series 18 years ago, the chairman of the Panetta Institute, former director of the CIA, and former Secretary of Defense. The economy is an issue he knows well from his time as chairman of the House Budget Committee, his time as director of the Office of Management and Budget, and more recently as Secretary of Defense when he had to deal with the impact of the sequester. Please welcome Secretary Leon E. Panetta. I love
you. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this, the 3rd forum of our lecture series. As you know, our theme is the test of leadership in 2015, critical issues that can unite or divide America. The first forum we had talked about energy. Second forum, we talked about race relations. We are already embarked on a presidential election, and if elections are decided by pocketbook issues, and I believe that they largely are, then perhaps the most critical issue that we should be talking about is our economy. My immigrant parents came to this country, like millions of others, with little money in their pocket and few skills. But they came in search of the American dream and knew that if they worked hard and they sacrificed, that ultimately they would become part of that broad middle class in this country that could enjoy the opportunities available in this great country. There is some question today as to whether or not that American dream will be available to our children, whether they'll be able to enjoy the same opportunity. And I think the reason that there's a question is that there is a gap that has developed in our society, recognized by both Democrats and Republicans, a gap that has resulted in shrinking that middle class, which was always important not only to our economy, but to our democracy. You know the numbers. We're looking at a situation now where the top 5% hold 65% of the wealth in this country. The lower 1/2 of wage earners hold about 1% of the wealth in this country. Those at the upper income level are earning 70 times more than those at lower income levels. Of course, there have always been differences between the wealthy and others in the society. We always embrace the hope that we too can move up in that scale. But the problem we're facing now is that what is happening is that the gap is reducing the middle class perhaps to its lowest point in more than 30 years. Some say not since 1928 have we seen the size of this gap. So I think it was important with these four distinguished speakers to kind of start off with a key question, which is, why is the middle class being squeezed in this country? And what is it we can do in order to restore a strong middle class to America? Michael?
Well, Leon, it's great to be here. Let's all congratulate Leon and Sylvia for this forum, and I want to just repeat that. I honor Christy and Bob's service. We occasionally disagree on some aspects of policy, sometimes in nuance, sometimes more fundamentally. Al and Ann Simpson, like Leon and Sylvia, are jewels that you find when you're in Washington that let you weather the nonsense you have to put up to do public service these days. So they're just great people, and I'm honored to be on a panel with these distinguished people. First of all, it's important to understand that the increase in inequality and the relative stagnation, I think properly measured, they've been growing slowly, not declining or stagnant, but they're growing very slowly, much more slowly than they used to be, is a global phenomenon. It's happening in all the major economies, and therefore there must be some general global causes that are the primary cause of this. It can't be just something that's specific to the U.S. Now, the U.S. is a less equal society than France or Germany and many others, not as unequal as Brazil, but it's unequal. So what are those forces? And pretty clearly the two large ones are technology and globalization. China started opening its economy to a, quote, socialist market economy, or their version of some form of capitalism, around 1978 when Deng Xiaoping made his southern tour. Then we had the collapse of the former USSR and their whole interaction with their, what we used to call satellites, although President Ford got in trouble for calling them that. And then Rajiv Gandhi did some reforms in the early 90s in India. This has added hundreds of millions of people to the global labor force able to produce traded goods and commodities. And that has put, and continues to put, downward pressure on the earnings of all but the most highly educated and skilled workers in the advanced economies. There are other factors, some that are American specific. I'm sure the other panelists mentioned, so I want to just be brief. I think the main problem isn't inequality per se. That's the manifestation primarily of stagnant growth of earnings for the broad population, and that our main problem is to enhance economic growth. President Kennedy exaggerated a bit when he said a rising tide lifts all boats, but it sure lifts a hell of a lot more than any other tide, and it leaves far fewer sunk or stranded. Bob will call them yachts, but that's another story. So we need to get our policy straight, because the foundation of it all has to be economic growth. There are things we have to do to complement that in our education system, in provision of certain services, in a more efficient but humane social safety net, all those kinds of things that we'll have plenty of time to talk about. But the prime message I want to get across is this is a global phenomenon. We need stronger growth. From the end of World War II, from 1948 till just before the Great Recession, the U.S. economy averaged 3.2% growth a year. That's averaged over booms and busts and average times. And we haven't had 3 consecutive quarters of 3% growth in a decade. So we have a big growth gap. That is part of the reason we had high unemployment for a while, part of the reason wages haven't risen. We're going to have to get growth up. There are many aspects to that, both on the demand and supply side, but let me stop and let the others talk about it.
Bob?
There's much I agree with that Michael just said. Certainly, every major economy is subjected to the same forces of globalization and technology and technological change. And we talk about globalization. a lot, you hear the word all the time, rarely has a word in our common discussions gone from so directly from obscurity to meaninglessness without any intervening period of coherence. I mean, basically, when we talk about globalization, we're talking not just about trade, but about integration of global economies through direct investment, through immigration to a large extent, and undoubtedly, Michael is right. You've got these two forces. But the interesting thing with the United States is the outlier in terms of inequality among all advanced nations. We are the most unequal. And the question is, how is it that these other nations, facing the same degrees of globalization and technological change, have managed to fight back against inequality, and we have succumbed as much as we have to it? And I think a lot of it has to do with two factors. They're not the only factors, but one factor has to be, because these other nations have stronger trade unions, labor unions. In the United States, if you go back to 1955, 35% of the private sector workforce in this country was unionized, which gave American workers the bargaining leverage they needed to get a substantial share of the gains from economic growth. Now, only in the private sector, less than 7% of workers are unionized. So there's very little bargaining leverage left. The second factor is education, and Michael mentioned this, but if you look at other advanced nations, they are not only spending more, but they're spending it better on education. We tend not to. In fact, so much of our primary and secondary education in this country is based on local property taxes, and we're segregating by income more than we've ever segregated before. So as a result, among all advanced nations, the United States is one of the very few that spends less per pupil on poor kids than we do per pupil on wealthy kids. It's not that we intended it that way, it's just the way we have decided to segregate by income into different townships and different cities. So I think, Leon, again, there's no easy cure, there's no easy answer, there are many other factors at play here, but I think that political decisions or failure to make the right political decisions have got to be part of the picture.
Christine?
Well, I'd like to start again by thanking everyone for being here and being how delighted I am to be on this panel, and to come back to where you started, because I really think you framed it correctly as the real issue is what's happening to that ordinary family, and that's where we have seen stagnation in, you know, the income of the ordinary family, actually in real terms gone down a little bit in recent years. And so thinking about what's behind that, inequality is a part of the story, because what growth we have has been going up to the top of the income distribution, but there are other factors. Michael's absolutely right that overall growth, sort of technological progress, just how fast are we coming up with new ideas, new inventions, and that has slowed down. And it was that really fast growth after World War II that was a big part of why we were able to see ordinary families have a real improvement in their income. And then the other sort of piece of the diagnosis, I think you have to put a role to what's happening with the labor force. We have actually been seeing, you know, whereas the story of the 70s was a lot of women coming into the labor force, the story of the last 15 years, and especially since the terrible recession, has been a lot of people dropping out of the labor force. And some of that is people hitting retirement age, but a frighteningly large part of it is prime age workers just either getting discouraged and leaving the labor force or going out for some other reason. And that's taking a toll on what happens to the income for a typical family. So if you think of that as kind of the diagnosis, then what do you do about it? And, you know, I think there are lots of things. I think there's an important role for public policy. I mean, in some ways, right, invention, that's our bright students that we got to meet with earlier today. That's the capitalist system. That can be good for invention, but there are ways that government can help, whether it's investing in basic science, it's investing in infrastructure. I think those things could be helpful for getting growth up. If you think some of the problem is the labor force, there are ways that we can try to bring people back into the labor force, maybe make it more flexible so parents don't feel the same either yes or no to the labor force, but more able to balance things. Or maybe older workers would be happy to work part-time but not full-time, and thinking about that kind of flexibility, I think, is important. And then inequality is absolutely something we need to deal with. Bob talked about some ways, but there are others. We have a tax system, and one of the things you can use your tax system to do is to raise more revenue at the top of the income distribution and use that to expand either education programs to give everyone an equal footing. You can expand the earned income tax credit to try to help people at the very bottom of the income distribution who are working hard, struggling to try to get ahead. So I think that should be on the table as well, and I'm sure we'll probably discuss that as time goes on. But it's a big issue, not surprisingly, with lots of causes and lots of possible solutions.
Alan?
First, thank you, and Sylvia. It's a wonderful program. I've been privileged to do it. That's called phlegm there. That's a cowboy said, you got a little phlegm in your throat there. Actually, it's called phlegm, I think, but whatever it is, it ain't worth a damn. But now, back, now people will begin to call. While he's out gallivanting around, Sylvia made this place work, and she is amazing. And so to her. You've just hit upon something that was so really puzzling to Erskine Bowles and I in our work. We worked for months, 8 months. There were 18 of us. We got 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 1 independent, that's a majority of the group, to vote for a 67-page report which hit everybody. Everybody ran from it, everybody. Don't blame the president or the House or the Senate or the leadership, because we dinged everybody, and it's not a good thing to do, but we did. And then people will say, well, who was on the commission? Well, I said, Durbin voted for it. Durbin, isn't that guy from Illinois, a commie guy? No. Well, Coburn voted for it. Coburn, that Republican from Oklahoma, for God's, that's your country right now. You just identify somebody of the other party and you nail them. You stereotype them. These guys both work beautifully. But what we found was grotesque. And it's something that you don't even know about, except you know about every part in it, but you don't know it's called a tax expenditure. Came into the book sometime in 1960 by some wizard in the Treasury who figured, how do we get this kind of money out of the system and people know it's not a tax increase? Well, all I can tell you is over 180 of them, and they take $1 billion out of the Treasury, which is exactly the amount of income that came in 2011 from individual returns. What are they? Oh, home mortgage interest deduction, employer deduction, employee health care, oil and gas depletion allowance, parking for employees, Blue Cross, Blue Shield, insurance, shot through by special interests who put municipal bond. I could leave everybody in this room limp. Okay, and Erskine and I said, well, get rid of them all. Just zero it out and give everybody from 0 to $70,000, you pay 8%. From 70 to 210, you pay 14. Everything over that, you pay 23. And take the corporate rate from 36 to 26 and go to a territorial system so you don't tax it twice. Everybody fainted. And they all talk about what they want to do, broaden the tax base, fix the rates. We did. And I can tell you, get this, only 20% of the American people use 80% of the stuff in the code. And who are those people? Let's everybody in this room get your hand way up. Because everyone in this room is using one of those 180 plus gimmicks that suck money directly out of the Treasury. I'm good at it. I have an accountant. You do too. You can't do it yourself anymore. And So there it is. And what are we doing about it? Nothing. They talk about tax reform. Every time they open the box, here comes the realtors. I happen to sleep with one. I sleep with a realtor. For 60 years I've been sleeping with that person.
With the same realtor.
It's the same realtor. We don't believe in duplex in our house. I married a twin too, and they said, "How do you tell them apart?" I said, "I never considered that my responsibility." But nevertheless, so just to tell you the reaction we had from the realtors on that, they said, "God, you can't waive this $1 million, interest tax reduction." I say, "Well, yeah. What's $1 million to most guys?" So he said, "Give everybody a 12.5% non-refundable tax credit, which helps the little guy that everybody talks about day and night in this game. Don't forget the game is played about the little guy and the poor and this and this." Well, when you have a situation like that, when only 25% of the people itemize and the other 75 haven't even heard of the stuff in the tax code, you got inequality, deluxe.
Let me ask you. Let me ask all of you, do we have to make a choice here between growth and redistribution? Because there is this debate about what should be done. Democrats are arguing that, or many Democrats are arguing that we need to obviously increase taxes, carbon tax, et cetera, and develop, greater programs to assist those that are in trouble, as well as increase regulation. To try to deal with market problems. And then, Republicans, I think Michael touched on this, have been arguing that growth is a better key to trying to deal with the issue of how do we restore the middle class, and that Democrats think that, we've ended growth in this country and that we now have to divide up the pie. What is it? What do we have to do? To be able to get it done?
I think to some extent, Leon, that's a false distinction. Okay. Because the way we get growth back is we have a large and vital middle class. That is, we can't get growth back unless the middle class has enough purchasing power to keep the economy going. 70% of the economy is based upon consumer purchases. And as long as the lion's share of the economic gains are going to the very top, that middle class is shrinking. So we have an inherent economic problem in terms of growth because of the lack of a vibrant and growing middle class.
I would disagree with that. I think that Bob's analysis has some validity in a deep recession temporarily, but in the long run, saving and investment drives productivity growth, which is the heart of improving living standards. And if you look over long spans of time over many countries, that's what's correlated with earnings or broad-based labor compensation, including fringe benefits and so on. So I do agree that both of these are problems, and I do agree we shouldn't be impervious to people hurting or to widespread inequality and lots of people falling short of their aspirations or not having opportunity. We ought to be addressing those things. But to suggest that we can do all the social engineering you want about the income distribution and have no ramification for slower growth, we can raise taxes as much as we want on the most productive people and the most successful small businesses in the country. We can have a lot of extra regulation. Well, it turns out capital is pretty mobile, and it'll move from locale to locale or from country to country as it is seeking its highest after-tax return. Now, not just taxes, there are many other things, not just looking for the lowest regulation. They want an educated workforce. They want to be close to their customers. So there's a lot of things going on here. One of the things that it's not popular to talk about, but I think most economists who have studied this would suggest that the single best thing we could do for single best policy reform, it's far from sufficient and far from something that's likely to have a large impact on the distribution of income, is our corporate taxation has gotten way out of line with the other economies of the world. We're 50%, our corporate tax rate's 50% over the OECD average. When you allow for deductions and depreciation and stuff, it's not as far out of line. But that's become a big problem. Predecessors of Christie and myself for Kennedy and Johnson, Art Oken, in his memoir said the most effective thing in the Kennedy tax cuts was the corporate rate cuts. Now, I'm not saying it's the only thing we should do or the tax reform is the only thing. We need more people and much more economic activity paying taxes, contributing to the pie. And we have some public investments we need to make, some of which probably have been shortchanged in these difficult budgetary times. But we ought to focus on programs that work, not just on spending money. We ought to focus on the outcomes, not just calculating the outcome by how much we spend, how much is input.
Christina?
I mean, I actually want to disagree with Michael. So, I think that a lot of these things are win-win. So Michael and I have had fights before about if you raise taxes on higher income people, how much is that going to cut back on effort and sort of productivity and things. And my read of the evidence is just not very much at all. So I think there are things that we can do that would actually improve equality, improve the standards of living for average families, and make us more productive. The classic win-win is education. That basically hits all my three reasons for why our middle class income stagnating. More educated people are likely to be in the labor force. If you're more educated, that's going to help you get a higher piece of the pie, so that's going to help with inequality, and it's good for economic growth. Any firm will tell you what they want are skilled workers and educated workers. So that's just a classic way that we can, as a society, invest. My other one I think a lot about is basic science, right? So there's a lot of R&D that private industry will do because they can see an idea, they can patent it, they can make money on it. Nobody can make money on basic science, right? That's just one of these, cool ideas of physics out there, and someday it will turn into a laser, and someday that will turn into something that you can actually sell, but that link is very hard. And so there's a kind of investment that's only going to be done by the public sector, but it is some of the most important investment we could do. And that is in basic medicine, basic science. And that, I think, is a place where we have been cutting back. And that's just like eating your seed corn in terms of your long run growth. So that's an example of something that we could do that's good for standards of living, good for all the things we care about, and would be a win-win.
Well, Alan, let me ask you. I mean, I understand these arguments, and I think, the reality is that I think you can have both. I really do. I mean, to a large extent, what we did in the budgets, particularly, Bush passed a budget for Bush 1 that actually addressed the deficit issue, got about $500 billion in deficit reduction. And Clinton did the same thing. Bob and I spent hours working on his budgets.
I was 6'1" when we started. It took a lot out of me.
He was already 7 on the cuts.
But one of the things we did that I was proud of was that, we addressed the entitlements. We got savings out of the entitlements. We went after all of them, whether it was Medicare or Medicaid or farm price supports, and we got savings. We achieved about $250 billion in savings. We also raised taxes, about $250 billion as well. Got about a $500 billion package in deficit reduction over, I guess, about 5 years. At the same time, Clinton also prioritized investments. Investments in research, investments in education, investments in infrastructure and other areas. And I think that's the way you should do it. I mean, the problem now is the Congress isn't even beginning to address the issue of the debt or the deficit. And so they're all kind of, running around trying to come up with simple answers that don't really address, the fundamentals in our economy and what needs to be done. Alan?
Well, there's sure a reason for that, too. If you're a Democrat and you're talking about entitlement reform, you'll be visited in the evening hours by the AARP and the AFL-CIO telling you that, by the way, we have a primary opponent for you. You didn't know that, but the way you're talking, you're off the rail, pal, and we're going to have a guy run against you. Now, if you're a Republican, you'll be visited by Grover Norquist in his white robes and the Club for Growth, will come to you and say, you know, you're babbling. You were talking about revenue or taxes, and you know that's a sin here. And so you are going to have a primary opponent. Well, what do you think they do? They worship the God of re-election, and they're going to say, well, I had a vision there for a while, but it passed. But that's where your country, that's your country right now. These people are in a safe district. They have pleased their base so beautifully that you couldn't beat them. And that's something Erskine and I really, really saw all over the United States, a tremendous power of the groups to wipe out anything that isn't part of the doctrine. And boy, the doctrine is with Republicans is revenue and taxes is a sin, and with the Dems it's don't touch anything with entitlements for Social Security. And you can't get there without that.
Bob? You know, we're suffering a little bit from a kind of collective amnesia in this discussion, because between 1946 and 1981, we had the formula. We invested in education. We invested in infrastructure. We invested in basic R&D. We had a tax system that really, between 46 and 81, the top marginal tax rate was never below 70%. The effective tax rate, after all the deductions and so on, was about 52% on the top. And we got control over our deficits. We invested in young people. We had enormous economic growth. We had faster economic growth per year between 46 and 81 than we have subsequently, even with those high taxes. We knew how to do it, and we had labor unions, as I said before. The question to me is why we lost the formula. It's not, do we emulate the Germans or the Swedish or somebody else? Why did we lose, very suddenly, a formula that really did bring massive, widespread prosperity?
Why did we?
Well, I think it has to do with politics. I mean, I think there were political decisions made, starting in the late 70s and all the way through the 80s and early 90s, by Republicans and by Democrats, to cut back on the investments that Christie is talking about, to change the tax code, to make it harder to unionize in many respects, to not provide the opportunities that we provided. Public higher education, something that I am now embedded in. I mean, the University of California in the 1960s, tuition and fees were what? Almost zero. Now they are, for many families, almost unaffordable. So if we actually dissect what we were doing right then and why we lost our way, I think we can have a much more effective discussion and I think a more affirmative discussion. This does work. You're right, Leon. And let me just say, while I have the floor, Leon Panetta, I want to brag a little bit about you, Leon, because I've known public servants who are very good. I've known public servants who are excellent, and I've known excellent public servants who actually take on the jobs that nobody in their right mind would ever take on. And Leon is all three. And Leon, you were there over this transition period. I mean, you worked in the Nixon administration, you worked in the Clinton administration. You saw a lot of these changes.
Yeah, no, I think the thing that has been the most frustrating for me is watching the dysfunction in Washington. Alan and I kind of shared that. If you have a dysfunctional Washington in which, you know, the president and the Congress, for whatever reason, can't work together, and Democrats and Republicans can't work together, then the reality is they're unable, for whatever reason, to address issues as they are today. They can't address the key economic issues facing this country. They can't come up with a budget deal. They can't deal with immigration reform. They can't come up with a comprehensive energy policy. They can't do infrastructure funding. They can't do tax reform. So all of the fundamental issues that are key to trying to deal with our economy, the dysfunction in Washington is preventing us from finding those answers. So I don't know, you know, what will it take, because the next president of the United States, be it Republican or Democrat, that president, biggest challenge facing that president is how do you get this country to govern itself again? And I don't know, you know, how that will work. I think you mentioned money in politics. Money in politics is a big part of the problem.
I think the next president, whoever she is going to have to deal with the reality that we have more money in politics now than ever before, and a lot of it is coming from the same place where a lot of the wealth and income in this country has gone to.
You know, the thing that I remember, when you get into Social Security, don't forget, that's the biggest expenditure of the government. I know all the arguments. I put in it from the beginning, and I want it all out. Well, if you're 83, and I am, I got all mine back years ago. Furthermore, I never put in over $874 a year, all during the 18 years of my practice of law, and nobody else did either, self-employed. Finally went to $1,200, $1,500 a year, and you whine like, you know, oh my God. And then went to 2003, and then 6 and 12. And when I left the Senate, the average guy was getting everything back they put in, plus 6%. We added that to it in the Danforth Carey Commission, and they were getting it all back in 4 years. Now, you can't tell anybody that, but I'll tell you what happened to me. In practicing law, I'd have clients come in, they'd say, Al, I got my Social, this is in the 70s, early 70s. I got my Social Security check, it went up 8%. I said, no kidding, that's great. Well, it is great. Next year they came in and said it went up 14. Don't forget what happened in those years, and it was done by people wanting to run for president. They knew if they could ease the quadrant out there of then would be 50 million people by saying, I was the guy that raised your Social Security benefit. Don't forget it was, and there were Democrats and Republicans playing that game, and it was unbelievable. These checks just kept coming in and bigger, and then I don't know when it stopped, but then when they set the level saying it couldn't go up worse than any more than inflation. Inflation was at 1% once, and a guy got up of my party running for president, said, I think it ought to go 2%, even though it violates our code. And boy, it went through there like a dose of salts. Now that's the way this works. And I tell you, it is a cruel thing to have a system that was set up by a pretty smart guy named FDR, and it was that you retired at 65 and you died at 62. and now the age of mortality is 79, and you can retire at 62. Who is kidding who in this game? It's cruel to you young people out there. Cruel is the best word, because when I was a freshman at the University of Wyoming in 1950, there were 16 people paying into the system and 1 taking out. There are 3 people paying into the system now and 1 taking out, and in 5 years there will be 2 people paying in, 12 grand each, so some old coot can get out 25. And if you think there's class warfare or difficulty, and the AARP accuses us of class warfare by bringing this up, I mean, just use your common sense. Use math, just math.
Let me ask you, where are the jobs of the future? You know, we've seen a huge technological revolution. We've seen computers. We've seen robotics. We've seen, you know, jobs that are lost as a result of this new kind of you know, technological revolution that's taken place. Where are those jobs of the future going to be? Michael?
Well, first of all, I think they're going to be in many swaths of the economy, some of which we can't predict. If you talk about where they're going to be 20 years from now or 30 years from now, go back 20 or 30 years. Go back to 1980 when everyone was talking about when the income distribution was more equal. The earnings premium has risen since then. The inequality has increased. Think of all the things that have happened since that you would have said Michael must be off his meds if I had predicted in 1980. We had a second oil crisis. Would you believe that 3D seismic imaging and then fracking would free us largely from the power of OPEC? The personal computer had just been invented. Deng Xiaoping had just started opening up China. The Berlin Wall wouldn't fall for another 9 years. It was still widely debated whether we were all going to converge on a social welfare state somewhere to the left of Sweden, communists rounding off some of their rough edges, et cetera. And except on some college campuses, at Stanford as well as Berkeley, Communism has basically collapsed as a central organizing principle for an economy and polity, thank goodness, for all the misery it wrought. So there are a lot of things, and women, we talked about, Christy mentioned the rise of female labor force, especially when it was just beginning. If we would have said that women would be a majority of college graduates in a generation, you would have said you're nuts. So I think it's kind of hard to predict. There are a few basic large forces we know will be operative for a long time, like demography. So the things that are involved in healthcare, medicine, biosciences, doing those sorts of things. Technology is not going to get less important, it will get more important. How much more important will depend on a lot of things. How long Moore's law, the chip performance doubling every 18 months has to run. The pessimists say it's getting more expensive. It costs Intel $6 billion to build a fab now. The optimists will say, well, we can make three-dimensional chips now, and we can use software to distribute loads among chips. So there's fundamental science and engineering, some of which will be the part I agree with about the investment in basic sciences on public money. We doubled the budget of the NSF when I was CEA chairman in a very, very difficult budget environment where we used to think we had large budget deficits back then, Leon. It's kind of a joke now. But so all those things suggest that if you're looking at a report from some bureaucrat in the BLS saying there's where the jobs are going to be, calculating this to the third significant figure to this many thousands of jobs, it's very likely to be off. So I think that it's going to be in lots of places. I think we're going to have a demand for energy. We're going to have to reconcile our energy needs, economic growth, and environmental concerns. So while I think that it's, the pace at which that's going to happen has been greatly exaggerated by people who want to force feed it, it's happening slowly. There will be those kinds of jobs, and alternative energy will eventually grow to significance. Right now they're very small relative to, say, fracking jobs. So there are a variety of things of that sort, and something I know Bob has written a lot about and I strongly support is a technical training for people repairing and making stuff. He's a big advocate, and I support this. And generically, we might have differences in how we do it. Apprenticeship programs, junior college programs that train people for productive jobs that are likely to be, as you say, repairing and maintaining stuff and so on. But I'll turn it over to them.
Jobs, Bob.
Well, I would say I agree with Michael. It's very hard to predict particular sectors, particular kinds of jobs. But I think that there are basically three broad types of work we're going to see in the future. The first I would call kind of creative, innovative jobs. These are problem solving. You probably need a lot of education and the right connections. You're going to make quite a lot of money. You're going to be innovative not only in high tech but in finance, in medicine, wherever, really right across the board. We need more innovation. The second category of jobs that people don't really think enough about, and Michael alluded to, are, I call them technician jobs. These are the jobs of people who know a lot about a particular domain of technology so that they can install, repair, upgrade, maintain. We're becoming intensively software-driven, technologically driven, but we don't have enough people who actually know how to do this stuff. And we don't have, in this country, a good enough technical education kind of path for a lot of people. We have this conceit that everybody, in order to join the middle class, every kid has got to have a 4-year college degree. That's a conceit. I think we really do have to establish a world-class system of technical education. Again, we once had that. And then thirdly, everyone else is going to be in the personal service sector. And by that I mean retail, restaurant, hotel, hospital, surface transportation, child care, elder care, all of the occupations that require direct connection, one-on-one, attention. They don't pay very well. Just in summary, it's not that we're going to have too few jobs. We'll have enough jobs. The real problem is that most of those jobs, given where we're heading, are not going to pay very well, and that's they're going to be in personal service. And that's going to create a huge problem. It's already slowing down wage growth.
Yeah, I was listening to Michael, and it brought to mind, when I was CEA chair, I was on a a mission to China, and I was meeting with a group of Chinese academics, and they said almost your same question, except they said, "What's your next industry? Where's America's next industry?" They were really quite shocked when I said, "I don't know," and it's not my job to know, right? That in a market economy, I'm going to be less good at guessing what the next big growth industry is than the entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley or Detroit or wherever. But one of the things, and certainly when we had a group of students here this afternoon, I think one of the biggest lessons for them is flexibility. One of the things we do know is the era where you go to college, you get a job, and you stay in that job for the rest of your career. Those are almost surely over. And the numbers are that the chances are most people will reinvent themselves many times. And so certainly as an educator, one of the things I think a lot about is how do you give people the skills that'll let them reinvent themselves, because we don't know what industry they need to are going to be doing things in. So is it creativity? Is it personal communication? Is it being able to write? Is it technical skills? But I think that is where we need to focus. And then if I were to guess, one of the things I certainly remember fighting against, there is a sort of notion out there that the good old days when America made stuff, right? Where stuff was a washing machine, or it was a car, it was something you could see. And I think we shouldn't be ashamed of the fact that as an economy, we are moving more towards services. Services are valuable too. There are good things to produce, whether there's architecture, medicine, finance. Those are admirable education. Those are admirable things. And I think we will be doing more of those as time goes on. That's where America seems to have a comparative advantage. And so again, that's fine, and we just need to make sure we train our kids to do those jobs.
Alan, where are those jobs?
Well, what I find is that their young people want a job, but they don't want to work. And a job, whether you're haying, and I did that, or bartending, or whatever I did, I had to work. And I worked on a road crew, and I was a tamper, brilliant, And, but I worked, and I got paid. But nowadays, they'll take a job. It's listed, their job openings every day on KODI, Cody, 180 of them. Nobody's taking them because they involve effort, and they involve work, and it may be demeaning work. That's the worst kind. When your buddies at night and you're drinking a suds, say, "What'd you do today?" "Well, I cleaned toilets down at the Walmart." That isn't going to get you any kind of peer group approval. But let me tell you, there are jobs, nobody knows what this is. I watched Michigan go down the tubes, and Indiana on the ropes, and Wyoming is rolling. They've got a thing called the Jonah Field, huge. The Boskin in North Dakota, another huge. People left Michigan and came to those areas. They lived in man camps. Their families were back home. Not a good situation. Lots of problems in that situation. But then now the oil went back down, like it always does, boom and bust. And they moved on to somewhere. And they're moving by themselves, waiting to get something, and they're ready to work. You work in the oil patch and you work. And now they're waiting to find something so they can join with their families. But the business of the job report, and then remember the guy who was a middle management guy, 55 years old, and he lost his job in this great experience. And now he'd like to do something, but when he went to sign up, the guy in front of him had 3 smartphones sticking out of his pocket and a computer dangling from his hip pocket, and this guy doesn't even know how to turn them on. And he's never going to get back in. And that's the saddest part of all, but I don't know the answer, but I think there's a better way to talk about jobs. There are plenty of jobs out there, but nobody wants them. And I'm not saying, look, Erskine and I never touched SSI. We never touched anything in the welfare. We never touched food stamps. People say, well, you guys were pretty tough. I said, don't give me that crap. We didn't touch that stuff. We weren't doing that. Read the 67-page report. And it's just a sad situation where people just aren't responding.
Let me mention another area before we go into our break. The whole issue of globalization. We're living in a world now that is interconnected by the internet, by communications, by finance, by trade. And globalization obviously has played a role in some of the job losses that have taken place. Well, that now is part of a debate in Washington with regards to trade agreements that are being negotiated by the president. There's the TTP agreement. I think that involves 11 Asian countries in the Pacific Rim and would obviously open up marketplaces in that part of the world. There's another trade agreement with the countries in Europe. And I think we're talking about over 40 countries that would be involved in both of these trade agreements. The president is trying to get fast-track authority from the Congress, which would allow these agreements to be able to be voted on without amendment, which is something that has happened in recent history. And interestingly enough, he's working with Republicans. He's got some Democratic support, but Democrats are opposed because they're concerned about the issue of job losses. They're concerned about the impact on labor issues, et cetera. On the other hand, the argument for trade is that, as the president has said, is that it can produce additional jobs and help our economy and get us involved in trade, particularly in Asia, with China dominating so much of that marketplace. Who's right on that issue?
I think on balance, the president's right. I think trade is a positive-sum game. Think of when you trade something with a friend. By definition, you wouldn't do it unless you're at least as well off. So both people tend to be better off. Same with trade among nations. It's also true that that's an aggregate of the whole country, and there are losers as well as winners. And we have procedures to try to cushion the losses to the losers, trade adjustment assistance, other types of programs and the like. But they're imperfect. And so our political process, you talked about it being dysfunctional, it's organized, other than at the president and vice president level, by local area, by congressional district or by state. And textiles are very powerful in the Carolinas, which is why it took us a long time to get rid of all the quotas in textiles, et cetera. And you can go on and on, state by state. So those interests get represented locally, and they oppose anything that might be a transition cost to them. And that has to be overcome by the general benefits and any adjustment program. So I think the president has the better of the argument intellectually, but both parties have their protectionists. So we have the Buchanan wing of the Republican Party, and you have a large protectionist, largely environmentalist labor union wing of the Democratic Party. And so I think it will be an issue whether the president gets trade promotion authority. I hope he does. I think there's a probably 51-49 he will with a lot of work. But it's important to understand what's going on. Leon mentioned that it's not a trade deal you're approving. It's the authority of the president to negotiate it and then present it to Congress for an up or down vote. The reason that's important is nobody else will negotiate fully with us. They're not going to do the same thing we have to do, which is promote our interests and occasionally have to recognize we're going to harm some sector or some group in our society and try to deal with it later. And they're not going to put their best offer on the table if they know our Congress can come along and amend it. So I think the appropriate thing to do politically and the appropriate thing to do for the benefit of our country is to give the president and the U.S. Trade Representative authority to negotiate a final deal, and then it should be carefully examined and we should vote. I think if they do their jobs right, a negotiation can produce trade agreements which will stand up to this test of, on balance, it being worthwhile, and the rough edges can be rounded off for people who are hurt.
Bob, you have a different view.
Well, I have a different view because of the context right now. I mean, we've been talking here about inequality, about raging inequality. I mean, one thing that we didn't even put on the table is that since 2009, the start of the recovery, 95% of the economic gains have gone to the top 5%. Most people have seen no wage gains at all. Many people are struggling, even at this stage of the recovery. You have a minimum wage that is 25% below what it was in 1968, adjusted for inflation. You have almost no investment that is really on the ground, running and up for most people in terms of workplace and job retraining and upskilling. You don't have an educational system that, in terms of public higher education, we talked about that. It's getting more expensive and more elusive for so many families. You have almost no investment in infrastructure in terms of all the deferred maintenance. So you have a lot of people that can't get houses that are near their jobs. So look at the large picture of what's happening in the middle class, the old working class, and the poor, and then you look at trade. And we know that the gains from trade outweigh the losses. The winners could compensate the losers and still come out ahead, but they never do. That's the problem. The winners from trade tend to be upper income people with very well educated people. The losers tend to be working class people, lose their jobs, lose their manufacturing jobs, and trade adjustment assistance, Michael, doesn't work. It's too limited. It's too narrow gauged. So I would say, unless we have a context, unless we have policies that actually are designed to lift people up and share the gains from trade, we're just going to exacerbate inequality even more, exacerbate social tensions, shrink the middle class even further. One other thing I need to be put on the table. The Trans-Pacific Partnership has within it an investment device, a kind of a jurisdictional device that allows any global company to challenge the health, safety, environmental, and labor regulations of any country as somehow interfering in their profits, and allows those companies to get reimbursed by the countries for any health, safety, environmental, or labor regulations that inhibit their profits. Right now, we've got cigarette companies, tobacco companies all over the world who are challenging health programs, anti-smoking programs in developing nations under exactly the same provision. Most people don't know about this. I'm frankly concerned that this was engineered by a handful of big companies, and it's going to make it harder to do the kind of health, safety, environmental, and labor protections we need.
Christy, let me get your view, and then I'll go into the break. Go ahead.
Okay. I mean, I think the big picture is, though, I mean, I don't think trade agreements are going to have that much of an effect on jobs. It's, in fact, we're a pretty low trade barrier country in general. We have pretty open borders for goods and services. And so when we negotiate a trade deal, most often or most of the time what we're doing is leveling the playing field by getting other countries to lower some of their barriers. So I think it's easy to overstate sort of how much of a change it may have. I also wanted I mean, it is true that the globalization has tended to help high-skilled workers because there are a lot more lower-skilled workers throughout the world. But, poor people do buy things, right? And one of the things that trade does is lower prices for a lot of the things. So, there's a reason why, clothing, I notice, is a lot less expensive than it was 20 years ago. And some of that is because of trade. And that is something that kind of everybody buys. So we don't want to lose the gains are perhaps more widely shared than you might have realized. The last piece I'll throw into this, I think a big part, and this is something you mentioned, Leon, I think a lot of these trade deals are much less about economics and much more about foreign policy. It is wanting to be friends with the other countries of Asia. It's wanting to strengthen our ties with Europe. And I think if you think of them more as a security policy, a foreign policy, a making sure that we have a presence in Asia and we're all on the same team, I think that may give you some sense of why the president is fighting so hard for this, not just for the economic side, but also for the foreign policy side. It'd
be a lot easier for that if he allowed natural gas to be exported and help the Europeans get off of Russian gas. That would dominate anything in the trade agreements.
Alan, for or against the trade agreement?
Well, I've always supported them. I worked with Lloyd Benson, Senator Benson. You know how he worked on that, and it was very bipartisan. NAFTA, I don't think it's been bad. You know, you can bring up a horror story on anything at all. That's the key to Washington, by using emotion, fear, guilt, or racism to do it. That's critical, that you use emotion, fear, guilt, or racism to pass or kill a bill. And now you've got a dollar that's strong, and guess what's happening? It's hurting exports. I mean, when are you going to figure that just do it? Because if you do it, you're going to get all the things that Christina is talking about. And if you're worried about human rights over in another country, they read and write what's going on in Baltimore. They're not listening very well. That's where they hit you back. It's crude and it's not true, but all they do is dig that up and say, you're giving us lectures on human rights, and I've seen Ferguson on television, I've seen Baltimore, I've seen this guy, and so don't give us that. And then environment, what's the worst environment? To have people here who don't have jobs. The best human right is a job. There is no thing better for a human being than a job.
All right, thank you.
Yes, you're cutting me off, but go ahead.
Well, I mean, if you have something worthwhile...
No, I don't have it. I just started to rant. I was ranting.
It was such a good line. It was right place to stop.
Good line.
I enjoy your rants, Alan. I really do.
That's a tough one.
You know, we used to escape from our offices when I was Secretary of Labor and Alan was a senator, and my staff said, don't have lunch with that Republican right-wing fascist. And what did your staff say to you?
My staff said, you're going to have lunch with Bob Reich, that commie over there in the labor? I said, yeah, we like each other.
We snuck out. I mean, it was like having an illicit affair. And I'd meet Alan, and we'd go, shh, don't do it. It's worse, Alan. It's worse. It's worse now in Washington.
These guys had a television show that was called The Long and the Short of It.
Alan, stand up for a second. Now, I want to...
Wait a minute.
Now, wait. Wait a minute. We embody inequality.
It's true. Whoop.
All right, I'd like to take a moment now to recognize our question review team, the people responsible for selecting the questions that we're going to be asking in the second part of the program, and I'd ask you to hold their applause until I introduce all of them. First, Julie Copeland, who's the city editor of the Santa Cruz Sentinel, Fran Gaver, who's an attorney with Leach & Walker and also a veteran member of our question review team, Doug McKnight, who's a reporter for KAZU Radio, Don Miller, who's executive editor of the Monterey Herald and the Santa Cruz Sentinel, and Pete Wyvorski, who is the executive editor of the Salinas Californian. If you would thank them, please. We also have a group of students that are representing those who attended the afternoon student program. We have a great afternoon program that involves students from all over the Central Coast. And I would like to ask those students that are here to please stand up, and please remain standing until I read the schools that you're representing. The schools are the Defense Language Institute, the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, the Navy Postgraduate School, and the University of California at Santa Cruz. Thank you very much. All right. We had a wonderful turnout of students this afternoon. I think we had a great program. I think the speakers enjoyed the opportunity to talk with young people. The program is made possible because of the generous support of our lecture series sponsors. And Sylvia and I, along with the board of directors of the Panetta Institute, are very grateful for that sponsorship. It allows these students from high schools, from colleges, universities, or military installations from throughout the Central Coast to be able to come here and participate and listen to our speakers. So I would appreciate it if you would give our sponsors a hand. Okay, let's turn to the questions from the audience, and try to keep your answers as tight as you can. What was the federal government's best and worst economic decision during the Obama administration? Christy.
Have some water.
All right. Well, let me start with what I think was a really important one, which was the Recovery Act. So I know it is a controversial piece of legislation, but I will tell you, I think it was highly effective. And if you had been sitting in my job in December and January of 2000, December of 2008 and January of 2009, you'd have been very worried because we not only were at the edge of a precipice, we were on the way down very fast. And I think the evidence as it has come out is that the Recovery Act was indeed helpful. It wasn't perfect. It could have been designed better. I sure wish it had been bigger, but I actually think it made a huge difference to what ended up happening. The other thing I would mention, and this I will actually give a shout out to the previous administration, because I actually think the other even more hated piece of legislation was the TARP, and the Troubled Asset Relief Program. Right? There's a name that will kill anything, but you know, and it was passed in a hurry. What it was passed as ended up not what it was used as. But it is one of the things that helped save the U.S. economy. So if you remember back to the collapse of Lehman Brothers, and financial firms were in very precarious position, and this is one of those times people were able to come together. And I guess that's the only reason why I'm not quite as depressed as maybe the rest of the people on the panel, because I saw that when the going was really tough, and when the Secretary of the Treasury and the Chairman of the Fed said, if you don't do this, we are going down, Congress found a way to do it. And it took them 2 votes. It took a big crash of the stock market in between, but by golly, they finally did it. And what it did was basically give a bunch of money. We were able to put money into financial institutions. Importantly, almost all of it came back, but what it did was stabilize them. It was money that you could put in, so you could say, look, people, there's a lot more capital in these institutions. And it wasn't an Obama administration program, though we inherited it and we fought to get it continued. But I think it was really important, and as hated as it was, we should all be very grateful that it was passed.
Michael, I'm not going to push her on the worst decision, but I'd like to ask you what you think the worst decision.
Well, by the way, I agree that there were many antecedents that caused us to be in the situation we were, and administrations in both parties and the private sector all bear some responsibility for getting us to the financial crisis and the collapse after Lehman Brothers. But I do believe if we didn't put capital into the banks that we would have had a big problem. I think it was done very poorly. And I'm critical of my own party for the Treasury Secretary for how it was done and forcing it on all banks to need it. But I do think it was unfortunately necessary. I think the Fed deserves some credit for lowering interest rates in the early part of quantitative easing. I think the latter parts have been very ineffective and have created a lot more risk in the economy and a much more complicated exit for very small, diminishing and maybe even smaller, essentially zero returns. I think that to be fair and generous in the midst of a crisis, there's a lot of incoming information. You're not quite sure what's going to happen. You're doing your best. And so some leeway for some experimentation and some things working and some not. But there were some that were pretty bad failures, in my opinion. The program to relieve toxic assets from the banks, which was going to come 50% from the private sector, 50% from the federal government, subsidized with non-recourse federal loans, raised 3% of the money it was supposed to raise, and was basically inconsequential. That was a program a month after. Cash for Clunkers was originally sold as a great way to help the auto industry, and then when it moved up sales a few months, then they collapsed after it ended. The response was, it's great for the environment, but we paid 20 times the European Union carbon trading price per ton of CO2 emitted. So there were a lot of those things. I also, I think that the time when discretionary fiscal policy of the type Christie was referring to in the Recovery Act might work best is in a deep recession when the Fed's at the zero lower bound, and it certainly got enacted, but it was spent slowly. The maximum increase in purchase of goods and services in 2009, when it was needed the most, was 0.2% of GDP. And as President Obama said, the shovels weren't ready. In fact, it turns out that modern public infrastructure projects don't use shovels anymore. And they're not very labor intensive, and the skills that people have in home building aren't readily transferable to large public infrastructure projects. So that was more hopeful, and it didn't work out. So again, I want to be fair. There was a lot going on, and there were pluses and minuses, and we ought to allow some scope for some things not working out so well. But there were a couple of, like cash for clunkers and the toxic asset purchase program, that were pretty bad.
Let me ask you.
Can I just jump in for 1 second
Sure.
here, which is, it's really important to remember that a third of the Recovery Act was tax cuts, right? And those went out the minute they were passed. Another third was either state to local aid to state and local governments, or unemployment insurance, or those kind of things. So I will agree that a lot of the shovels weren't moving, but there was a big chunk that got out quickly.
Bob,
I have to quickly answer this. There are many
Soon
studies.
We're going to arm wrestle.
Many studies that show, I mean, if you look at what happened contemporaneously, there was a big increase in disposable income and no change in consumption. So we can argue there are many studies. Economists debate this as perhaps more fiercely than any subject in economics. So we'll just agree to disagree. I think it wasn't as successful as it might have been for different reasons than Christie's emphasizing, which she wanted it to be large.
Let me ask, Bob, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. The approach that was taken, particularly with the passage of Dodd-Frank, was that we have to get away from too big to fail. If you're, we ought to allow companies to fail. But I guess my question is, if we face the same kind of crisis in our economy as we did then today, would you do anything differently?
Yes, and again, it's easy in hindsight to say they should have done that or should have done this, but the biggest banks are far bigger today than they were then. The 5 biggest banks in the United States had, in 1990, 5% of all banking assets. Today, the 5 biggest banks have 44% of banking assets. They are too big to. They are now too big to fail. Clearly, too big to fail. And any bank that's too big to fail is just too big. Period. I would, use the leverage the Fed has to increase capital requirements and to actually break up the biggest banks. I think that's very, very important, Leon, right now. We should not get to the point where we have another too big to fail crisis. Also, I just want to mention something about what happened to homeowners, because TARP, the Troubled Assets Relief Program, was designed partly to relieve homeowners who were in trouble, who were underwater, who didn't have, who owed more on their houses than their houses suddenly became worth. And very little was done for homeowners. I mean, the banks got bailed out, but the homeowners didn't, by and large. I think that's probably partly to do, and Christy knows more about this, but the question of what conditions were or were not placed on the big banks in return for getting the bailouts. I think that there should have been much more restrictive conditions, including homeowners, no executive bonuses, no lobbying against Dodd-Frank or financial regulation. I mean, you guys got bailed out, for crying out loud, and you've got to be publicly responsible. And I don't think we had that.
If you'd had asked me the question of what did we do wrong, I would have mentioned homeowners. That is the thing that makes me sad that we didn't ever come in. We tried, but we didn't come up with as effective a program for homeowners. I think the one thing you have to understand that made it hard is we talk so much about inequality. And when you think about homeowners, even though a lot of them were really suffering, they're by and large the top half of the income distribution. And it was a hard decision to figure out, if you've got a limited amount of money, Are those the people you
went
want?
to the banks.
So, no. And the money from the banks came back. So just keep that in mind. But what made it hard.
But you know, we also remember nobody knew this was a completely there were no precedents, and in fairness, I mean, everybody was flying blind. I remember I was testifying. Marty Feldstein was testifying. Mark Zandi, two Republican economic advisors. I was testifying, and the question was, how large should the stimulus package be? And Marty Feldstein, Republican, was asked first, and he said $800 billion. And I turned to the other fellow who was just about to testify. I said, where did Marty get $800 billion from? And he said, I have no idea. And then they asked him, and he said $800 billion. Because Marty Feldstein had said $800 billion. So they came to me, and I said, $800 billion. So it was unanimous, but we had no idea what we were talking about. And how big was the fine? Well, how big was the
800 billion.
Of course.
821 billion. There, as we've all said, there was a lot of chaos. It was very hard to predict the future, as our greatest of all American philosophers once said, Yogi Berra. Predictions are tough, especially about the future, and in that situation, they were harder than normal. So I get you have to allow some things weren't going to work, but we should go back and evaluate them all and try to learn from them for the next time. An old idea we used to have that unfortunately never came about and has wound up being running the risk of getting politicized with all the other issues you mentioned, Leon, and a dysfunctional Washington, was to have a shelf of pre-approved projects that could be accelerated in a recession that passed stringent national cost-benefit tests. But if we could prevent that from being politicized, that might be one way to improve the efficiency of these things, for example.
Actually, there's a question that I have here along those lines. During the Great Depression, with large numbers of people out of work, FDR formed the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, to expand and improve the infrastructure of the country. Why then does this government not provide that type of option when the need for both is so obvious? Alan?
Well, I don't know, but I live in the land of what they did. The CCC camps. California has many of them in their mountain areas and wooded areas. And the guys that were doing the work were on Wall Street. You know, they were selling apples on the street, and they came through on rail cars, and they were called hobos. And my mother and father didn't know. My brother and I, we were about 8 and 9. We'd go over and they'd have a pot cooking with meat, and we'd eat with them. And they'd talk about what they had been doing in life. They had been in business. And they were humiliated, but they knew that to keep their sanity, they had to do something that had to do with hard work. If you ever get down in the dumps, start exercising. It'll get you out of the dumps. I weighed 260 and had hair and thought beer was food, so I can testify to that. But let me tell you, they went and did work in the Shoshone Forest and Yellowstone Park, and again, there's something averse to asking people, and Clinton helped us with that bill. There is something that you shouldn't be averse to, the fact that if you're going to receive a benefit and you're hale and hearty, you should work. Now, I'm not, no, don't. No, because they'll always bring up the frail person who's a steel worker, and Erskine and I even dealt with that in our plan. We said, look, we're not talking about everybody staying in the workforce so they can chip into Social Security. Those that can't won't. And we'll make accommodation, and we'll give an extra benefit to those 80 to 85. All the stuff that's in there that people love to use on you as an inhumane slob, we took care of in there. But at some point, if you're going to have a recovery program, and these people are ready to work. By the way, the Disability Insurance Fund will end next year. 0. Doesn't mean it's going to quit, but it means it's going to pay out about 25% less. And they've got to sustain it, because when people went into unemployment and it was tough, impossible to get back, they went back to the same doctor 3 or 4 times and said, I am disabled, you're not getting the message. And they're finding those frauds throughout the country. But when a system goes over 400% usage in 3 years, something is not right. And I'm not a cruel guy. That's not my life. I'm an optimist. But for the God's sake, if you're going to do these systems, then have some kind of contribution if you're able-bodied to get in and do things like this, where the need is so great, but nobody wants to take the job.
So I just have to, I mean, I agree with you with so many things, but I actually think, and so something you said earlier about young people not wanting to work. The young people I see are dying to work, and I see them working unbelievably hard in college. And I think most of the people that were out of work were desperate for a job. So I really think most people did want to work. I will tell you, the president very much wanted a CCC kind of thing, like, can't we do a public employment? And I remember we looked, it's hard. I remember calling around to basically every cabinet secretary, and I had one, I won't name the agency, but I said, okay, if money were no object, how many people could you hire? And he said, you know, lots. I mean, 10,000. Like, heaven's sakes, we've got 8 million people. You know, so, and Franklin Roosevelt in a program put 4 million people to work in a couple of months. And we tried to think about how to do it. It's a heck of a lot harder.
What was the argument against it now?
I mean, in some sense, let me describe the CCC. Most of the people in the CCC were young men who were sent off to the woods to, as you said, you know, build our national parks and things. And I think 75% of their salary was sent home to their mother. And when I talk about, I mean, that was a great program. Can you imagine setting that up today? It seems, I think, the kind of issues we'd face with infrastructure, the various, you know, getting something approved is so much harder today in a way it wasn't in 1930. And some of that's red tape, and some of that's we've gotten smarter. So it was hard, but I hear you, but I just had to push back over this sense of people not wanting
Let me just mention,
to work.
We do a poll at the Panetta Institute. Sylvia talked a little bit about this earlier. But we did a poll of college students around the country, and for the first time, 63 or 64% said that in exchange for benefits for education, they would be willing to be part of a national service system in this country for 2 years. I think something like that ought to be looked at, certainly in terms of taking programs that are there and combining them in some kind of system that would allow young people to work in our parks and healthcare, in the Peace Corps, and in the military. I mean, all of that is possible.
The problem, let's not just focus on young people. That's a really important thing. We all care about our children and grandchildren. And for the first time in probably since the Depression, a majority of Americans polled now think their children and grandchildren won't be as well off as they are. And that's undoubtedly some of the recession and the anemic recovery are part of the reasons for that. But we have some serious problems. But we have a lot of adults who are still underemployed or who have left the labor force, and we need growth to generate those jobs. We also have to redesign our government to be a lot more effective and efficient and much more results-oriented. We have several million jobs listing right now online by American companies saying they can't find workers with the skills they need. Those are not mostly software engineers. They're tool dyers and lathe operators and a lot of other things. That's part of the technical training you talked about, Bob. But there are a lot of things. We have 46 separate job training programs in the federal government in 9 different agencies costing $18 billion a year. If we had 3, and most of them don't work very well, many of them don't even bother to measure what's going on with the people when they leave. If we had 3 or 4 programs that work well and got a large multiple of the people skills that could be marketed in the marketplace, mostly for private jobs where most of the jobs are going to be, we could cost less money, it would cost less money, and we'd be doing our citizens a much bigger favor. That's something Republicans and Democrats should be able to agree on. And that's rife, in my opinion. Leon, you chaired the Budget Committee. You've dealt with budgets as Chief of Staff, and you dealt with the defense budget, and bless you for that. Bob was right that that's the toughest job there is. But it seems to me if you look over and over and over again, We have a lot of programs. They do a lot of good, but they have a lot of inefficiency in them, a lot of ineffectiveness. They can be tightened up. They can be targeted better. Those funds can be reallocated to the people that need them most and are most likely to benefit from them. And it seems to me that we need something comprehensive like that throughout the government.
Bob, let me ask you about that. You know, as a result of what happened in Baltimore, there's a whole focus on, you know, what's wrong, what's going wrong. We developed, since the Great Society, a number of programs to try to break the cycle of poverty. The New York Times yesterday had an editorial that talked about Baltimore and said that what happened was that federal programs, particularly in housing, literally failed and resulted in even greater segregation than what took place. As you know, a number of programs were developed to try to break that cycle of poverty. A lot of them have failed. What's the answer to trying to deal with it?
First of all, there's not one answer, but one of the biggest problems that we can, if we solve this particular aspect of the problem, we have an answer, has to go back to segregation by income according to where you live. You know, it used to be the case 30 years ago that almost every city had the poor and the rich and the middle class. Now we have entire cities that are very rich or entire cities that are very poor. And the middle class is kind of scattered and shrinking. But the concentration of poverty makes it harder and harder to get out of poverty because kids, for example, don't see any models of people who successfully make something of themselves in terms of going to college and getting work. You have the kind of, when you have entire cities like Baltimore that are basically poor, you compound the social problems of poverty because there are places in Baltimore where the lifespan, typical lifespan, matches the typical lifespan in Syria or Yemen. There are third world countries we have in some of our cities. And we always had urban poverty, but nothing to the extent that we now have. So one of the answers, and we know because we've tried experiments and there have been control groups, is to try to get people out of these concentrated areas of poverty. Whether we do it with vouchers or we do it with some other device, we just break up the concentrations of poverty. Very important.
Okay, let's turn to monetary policy. Will the Feds raise interest rates in September? Christy?
They seem pretty set on raising interest rates before the end of the year. I think September is the best guess. We certainly have been through a period what we've been talking about of the Great Recession where the Fed has had to take extraordinary measures and they're as ready to be done with it as anybody else. I think the trouble we're facing, I think Janet Yellen, the Fed chair, described it very well. You know, we're kind of recovering. We're doing better. We're adding 200,000 jobs a month or more. But we've been doing that in a world with with very, very low interest rates. And so I think one of the things she's worried about is if you start raising rates, will those job growth numbers start to go down?
Let me answer. The Wall Street Journal had an editorial, I think, on this issue that basically said that, you know, the purpose of the so-called quantitative easing and interest rates was to try to spur growth in the economy. And yet we've seen an economy that still is operating somewhere between 1% to 2%. And their argument was, why don't we just let the marketplace decide where interest rates should go? What are your thoughts?
Well, I have some sympathy for that. I think in the depths of the recession and the early recovery, there was such a big gap that it was appropriate to lower interest rates to close to zero. And even the early parts of quantitative easing, which I held my nose at and weren't done perfectly, I think were desirable. I think that the commercial paper market opened almost overnight when they had their commercial paper facilities, so let's not be doctrinaire about this. But I do think they now have a $4 trillion balance sheet, and they may hold it to maturity, which means it'll be much harder for private capital to come in because they're not quite sure what the Fed might do later. We're going to be down the road, interest costs are going to rise, and they're going to start taking capital losses on stuff they hold for a long period. They've made a lot of money in the meantime. They claim the way they're going to get out of that will be to raise the interest they paid banks not to lend, to keep the money inside at the Fed in excess reserves. That would be real popular politically when they start giving the banks tens of billions of dollars, given what Bob said earlier. So I think we've got a complicated thing here. I think, to use NFL language, National Football League language, it's more likely than not, more probable than not, that they'll raise interest rates in September, but I don't think this is going to be a stampede or even a gallop. I think it's going to be a slow trot.
You know, this goes back again, Leon, to one of the fundamental problems in the economy now, and that is lack of sufficient demand, lack of aggregate demand. I, again, attribute that to a middle class that doesn't have enough purchasing power. But if you don't have enough demand, and you ask the Fed to bear all of the responsibility for stimulating the economy, you're giving too much responsibility to the Fed. The Fed is not designed to do that much. You have no stimulation from fiscal policy. In fact, arguably, you have a fairly austere fiscal policy in the short term. Well, how do you, and you have, you know, you're not exports you can't count on to stimulate the economy. What are you going to do to get enough demand going?
The biggest part of demand that has fallen is business investment in proportional terms. So business investment has fallen the most in proportional terms relative to a typical recovery. There's the biggest proportional gap. It's 1/6 of the economy, not 2/3 as is consumption. And we've got a lot of policies that are discouraging that, from our high corporate taxes to misplaced regulation. We certainly need some regulation, but anyway.
Let's question on education, higher education. Is it possible to solve the crisis of high-cost college education and mounting student debt problems without the use of public policy? If so, how? If not, what kind of policy is necessary in order to assist young people to get a higher education?
Well, I think we have to move towards some sort of, let's call it income contingent loan system. That is, instead of just having students pile up $1.2 trillion of debts in a job market that is not even now very good for young people, I think we should say, for example, you pay back X percent, let's say 10% of your full of your salary for the first 10 years of full-time work, and then at the end of that period, whatever you pay back, you will be considered to have been fully paid. So that in that way, you get the investment bankers maybe subsidizing the social workers.
Bob, what's your answer to dealing with elementary and secondary education? I mean, you've proposed vouchers as a way to do that. Just give me a brief summary of that.
Well, this is a proposal I made years ago that nobody liked, so it must be right. It must be correct. And that is a voucher system that is where the amount of the voucher is inversely related to family income. So a poor family would get, let's say, $15,000 a year voucher to spend to send their kid to a school, a school that meets certain minimum public requirements. And a very wealthy kid gets, let's say, a $3,000 voucher. And the people on the left didn't like it because it's a voucher system. People on the right didn't like it because it involves a lot of money. And as I was telling Michael and a few others before, there was only, when I proposed this 20 years ago in the Wall Street Journal, I only got one person. Everybody dumped on it, which made me think it was right. But there was only one public official who called me and said he thought it was a great idea. And that was Jeb Bush. I'm not used to getting calls from Jeb Bush. In fact, that's the last time we talked. But I think we've just got to get out of the rut we're in. You know, where we're so, you know, one side said we want more tests. Well, more testing cannot be the answer. We're training a whole generation of children to take tests. You know, we're not training them to think. We need people thinking, not taking tests.
Well, Michael? I would agree you want to have the right balance in testing, but I think we actually don't want to get in a situation like we got in California. We had this whole language experiment and kids couldn't read. So I think we've got to be a little careful about whether we test or not and not test. We shouldn't just teach to standardized tests. I agree with you, we should encourage kids to think. I think the big problem in our K through 12 education for the bottom part of the income distribution and these urban areas that Bob has talked about is the lack of competition. What we have are monopolized school systems where we don't pay the better teachers more. People don't enter with the idea that if they do better, they're going to get their income going up. It's all on a standardized model. It's very hard to get rid of the bad teachers. And from what we know in educational outcomes, substituting an average or a better teacher for a poor one is immensely valuable to the future incomes of all the kids involved. And that has to do with actually taking on the teachers' unions, which are the reason that we're having a very hard time with things like merit pay. It's far from the only thing we need to do, and we may need to put more resources in some places and less in others. But I myself think that a large majority of Americans don't want to spend more money on a system that pour more money into a system that isn't producing results. That most Americans of whatever political party would be happy to do at least some of that if it was actually working, and therefore I'm still big on the reform idea as part of the fiscal changes.
Can I just respond, Leon? Because I think Michael is onto something. I just want to make sure. Obviously, teachers need to be responsible. There ought to be performance requirements. But we fool ourselves if we think that we can get talented people, men or women, into the classroom without paying them more. I mean, you've got to. You've got to pay people to go into the classroom.
Yeah, the good ones should be paid even more.
Okay,
that's the problem.
Alan,
it's hard to get people to go in if they're not being rewarded for being good, working hard, and getting better.
Alan, this is for you.
As they do everywhere else.
Why has the size of the U.S. debt gotten 5,000 times larger since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913? What created this huge debt that we're dealing with now?
Well, with my brilliance in fiscal matters and monetary policy, I mean, I didn't graduate cum laude, I graduated thankful laude. I don't understand this crap, but I'll tell you one thing. I don't know, I'm not one of those guys who say, get rid of the Trilateral Commission, get rid of the Federal Reserve, all that. I'm not one of those guys, but I am a guy that is saying, how can anybody be placing this kind of importance on a small group of people, some of them from regional areas of Dallas and Denver and so on, who are on the board of governors? 2 or 3 of them have blown their cover already, say, we don't know what the hell's going on. And all I know about QE1 and QE2 should have been called PM1, which is called Print Money 1, because that's what they did. And maybe that's just terrific. All I know, in our work, we found that the United States has $62 trillion in unfunded liabilities. $62 trillion. That's Fannie Mae, Freddie, that's pension guarantee, list them all. List all the government-sponsored entities, mystery land, who cares? And let me tell you, that is brutal, but the Federal Reserve, you know, it's like the Sundance Kid, and who are these guys?
All right.
You can do anything you want, go for it. But let me tell you, when you have a zoo of mystery and people talking about stuff, and they guard every single sentence in their notes and their things so they can shroud the whole issue. But where the hell do you think interest rates are going to go? They're going to go to 5 or 6% because that's a history of interest. So when are they going to do it? Incrementally, and then the stock market's going to go crazy? Yeah, well, yeah.
Right. Again, whoa. There's just one thing. I think this conflating what's going on with the debt and the deficit and the Federal Reserve is just really not correct.
Sure is.
That the Fed is, they happen to be growing at the same time, but it is, where does the government debt come from? You've told us what it is. It's the growth of entitlement spending. It's we haven't been raising funds to pay for it, all of that. I think that the history of the last 25 years is the Federal Reserve has actually, in many ways, done a good job. I think Paul Volcker helped us to get inflation down, and that was a good thing. I think every one of us would be so much worse off if Ben Bernanke had not done what he did during the heart of the crisis. They played an incredibly important role. And so, yes, I think I have concerns. I think they could have done some things better, but this sense that they're, somehow, and you ask why are they so guarded in their words, it's because every word that they say comes out in a transcript with a lag so that we can all know what they were thinking. And so this idea that it's
Let me ask you, put the Fed to the side.
I think that's appropriate.
We had not only a balanced budget, but we had a surplus. I mean, Alan Greenspan
at the end of the 90s.
We had such a huge surplus that Alan Greenspan was worried about paying down the debt at that point. And now we are back in a hole of $17, $18 trillion. How did that happen?
Leon, part of this is the stimulus, obviously, but part of it
the
also
recession, not just the stimulus.
All right, so the recession was one of the reasons. What else?
Here's one for you, and this will irritate the people that haven't been irritated yet. When George W. Bush took over, the debt was $5 trillion, and he took it to 11. There wasn't a single veto of a spending bill by George Bush with a Republican Senate and a Republican House. Don't miss this. I asked some of these guys who were my colleagues, what the hell, what was this about? Well, we didn't want to embarrass the president. We didn't want to embarrass the House. We didn't want to embarrass people in our own party. I said, you've embarrassed the United States of America. Taking it from 5 to 11. No, don't stop it. And then this president's taken it from 11 to 18. And why is it? Because they make promises they can't possibly keep, and you swallow it.
Well,
Michael and then Bob.
Just quantitatively, the recession was larger than the discretionary response like the Recovery Act. The amount of the deficit that's due to what's called the automatic stabilizers in the tax code, revenues falling if people have lower incomes, and some automatic social spending that goes into effect, was about $1.4 trillion between 2009 and 2012 or 13. So that was large, and that's always the case. What used to happen is we used to either run surpluses, or at least we had deficits that were small and smaller than our interest payments, so we'd wind up, actually, the economy would grow and we'd slowly pay down the debt-GDP ratio. And we've kind of lost that discipline. We've gotten to a point where we have modest deficits in a boom and big deficits. Now, I don't want to get into the math of the difference between the deficit and the debt. I don't want to bore you. But we've sort of gotten out of the way of that. I do want to come back to the central bank for a second, because while I agree that thus far what the central bank has already done has not put any immediate pressure on inflation, that if you look at the history of world history, large deficit spending by governments then winds up getting monetized by central banks have been the history of big increases in inflation and indeed hyperinflations like Weimar Germany. So I'm not saying that's going to happen. We have tools to prevent it if we're wise enough and politically astute enough to do that. But the fact of the matter is, it's going to be a more complicated task now. Whatever the benefits were of them doing this, it's a much more complicated task to raise interest rates and manage a $4 trillion balance sheet, which has a lot of long-run debt in it, government treasury debt, than it would be just to raise interest rates and have mostly just a small amount of short-term treasuries. So our task has become more complex.
I think that's absolutely right, but I just want to make sure that we focus on what is happening in the future to our fiscal policy, to our debt. A lot of that has to do with an aging population and rising healthcare costs together. And there's not much we can do about an aging population except allow in maybe more young immigrants. In terms of healthcare costs, we are beginning to have an effect. Nobody knows exactly why. They are still rising faster than inflation, but they're slowing down. But both of those are going to be contributing to very large deficits in the future. For my sins, I sat as a trustee on the Social Security Trust. I was a trustee of the Social Security Trust Fund and also the Medicare Trust Fund. And I can tell you the Social Security Trust Fund can be fixed without dramatic changes. Medicare is a bear. And it's a bear not because Medicare is inefficient. It's a bear because of these underlying demographic forces and healthcare costs rising.
But, okay, look, we mentioned the recession. I acknowledge. So 2008 recession hit hard, and we took that. But 9/11 happens, and we go to war as a result of 9/11. But there is no effort by the president to increase taxes to pay for the war, something that every other president in our history has done when we've gone to war.
Right.
So we established this kind of sense, well, we can go to war, but we don't have to make choices here. We can just go ahead and pay for that. And then a Medicare bill passed, speaking of Medicare, that increased pharmaceutical or pharmacy benefits for people, and it was not paid for. It simply went to the entitlements. So, you know, when you add all of that up plus recession, I mean, there is a lack of fiscal discipline that contributed a great deal.
Well, there's a lack of spending discipline, but let me ask you, Leon, you were Secretary of Defense. Is there any fat in the defense budget?
No, look, thank you. You know, we took $500 billion out of defense as a result of what the Congress asked us to do. $500 billion. I think, frankly, more could be taken out of the defense budget, and we still would have a very effective, efficient defense force. I mean, the biggest problem right now in defense, as Alan knows, is the whole area of health care costs and retirement costs, which are basically eating up a big part of the defense budget. We have made recommendations to try to control those costs. Yeah. All of the groups are opposed to those recommendations. Congress doesn't enact those recommendations. So if you have this large, I mean, we're spending over $50 billion just on health care alone at the Defense Department. If you're having that kind of bill and you've got to pay that, it's going to come out of readiness in our defense establishment. So if we want to be able to control those costs, we've got to control them not only in procurement, not only in force structure, but we've also got to control it in compensation and health benefits.
Well, and look at this is one of the hardest issues, but also paradoxically one of the easiest issues. Healthcare costs. I mean, we do not spend on preventive care in this country. Many of our healthcare problems can be prevented if we get diabetes, heart disease, some cancers, but we don't do it. You know, my father, when he was 80 years old, began walking 2 miles a day. He's now 101, and we have no idea where he is. We know where he is, but
I think it is also worth noting. It's also worth noting in defense of both President Bush 43 and President Obama. Right after 9/11, there was, in a national security sense, the same kind of uncertainty that there was in economic and financial sense in late 2008. Nobody knew that this would go on for 10 years, would likely do. No one knew what the missions would morph into and what had happened, et cetera. Nobody would have predicted we wouldn't have had another major attack in the U.S. then. We were all very fearful of that. So it's also worth noting that President Roosevelt financed 3/4 of World War II by debt. And then we paid it off by growth and some better spending control afterwards and demobilization. I think the really essential issue is, in the Defense Department as elsewhere, getting the kind of reforms you're talking about, but making sure that our readiness, our training, our equipment, and our technology is so far advanced that we have a military that we can use when we need to use it. You can argue about the missions and what politicians are doing. I don't want to discuss that now. But I think that we're in a very serious problem here. The military preparedness and training and active forces budget and equipment and technology budget is under deep threat from two things. One, inside the defense budget, the health and retirement stuff gobbling up the defense budget, and in the overall budget, general entitlements crowding out defense, which are headed to their lowest level since 1940 as a share of GDP. I'm not saying we can't save more, but we can't continue that forever.
Let me add. Here's one that
make it fast.
This will be the end of it. The defense budget of the United States, I think they're asking for $560 billion. The defense budget of the top 10 countries on Earth, including Russia and China, are less than that combined. Okay, hear that? 560 versus 530 over on the other side, 10 of the biggest countries on Earth, including Russia and China. and that we're short sheeting. Now, what we did to dig in, and you were there, Leon, you couldn't do a thing because guys like me, I'm a veteran, I'm a member of the VFW and the American Legion, they will tear a guy like that to shreds. And I'll tell you why, what's happening. This thing is, there's a military retiree. There are only 2.2 million of them. If I'd stayed another few years in the reserve, I would have been one. And they have their own health care plan called TRICARE, and the premium is $540 a year. And no copay, but it went up $3 copay last time, so that's important. And it costs $53 billion, and 85% of it goes to the dependents of those guys or the guys on TRICARE. There are 64 Department of Defense schools in America. Do you know that? 64. Ann taught at one when I was at Fort Benning. They should be overseas, and they are. They're all a bus ride from a public school. And they all have a superintendent and a principal and teachers, and it costs $52 billion a year for less than 20,000 students. And then you got commissaries, which were set up as a recruiting device.
All right, Alan.
No. You need. It'll be
I'm down to 1 minute.
Yeah,
pal.
and then you got a commissary, which is used by the old coots so they can buy their scotch in there and their lettuce for less. And you're telling me you can't take care of the Gulf and Harry Truman? You can't fuel it? That's bullshit.
I think we can blip that out. That's right. That's right. Listen, I want to thank all of you. We've covered a lot of territory, and obviously the economy is a complex issue. It's a difficult challenge for whoever becomes president of the United States, and it's going to be one of the things that a new president is going to have to confront and make these tough decisions that we just talked about. But in the end, it really is about whether or not we can make sure that young people can achieve the American dream. And that's something all of us want. So please thank our speakers and thank all of you.
I did a little ranting.
I'm losing mine too.
Thank you. I'm sorry to ramp at the end.